I'm going to be doing a comparison today between my recently purchased Fuji X-T30 and a Sony a7 III, which my good friend Stefan let me borrow. Something I haven't tried before that I'm trying for the first time is one, do the talking head portion of my videos using the Osmo Pocket. Just have it tracking my face right now automatically, which is super awesome. I have my phone as the viewfinder. Originally I was considering, before getting the Fuji, and even before the a6300 when I had it, getting some of Sony's full frame cameras. The a7 III wasn't out then, and the a7 II just didn't seem like it'd be that great of a deal for me. And then when the a7 III came out, shortly before the Fuji X-T30 came out, I thought that might be a good option for me. Obviously I didn't end up getting it. I went with the APS-C form factor still and saved about $1,000 by doing that. But now we're actually going to go ahead and put them head to head and see how they compare. Quick filler background with this video, and what I'm trying to do is I'm going through and I'm editing it right now. I'm figuring that this might be kind of crucial and important to kind of the objective of this video here. So obviously, again, we've got the Fuji X-T30, which is what I'm filming on now. And just as I was going through and editing that footage, I noticed it might make a little more sense if I kind of explain this. I have the two cameras, and one's a full frame, the a7 III, and one's the APS-C camera, the Fuji. One's also about $1,000 more, much heavier, much bulkier. It kind of is targeted towards a different segment, if you will. So putting them both together, I wanted to see how closely could I get the Fuji to look like the Sony. Being that it isn't my camera and I didn't have like the ability to choose exactly what I wanted with it, I worked with what I had. I was using a G Master lens, and I'm comparing it to the Kit lens, which is the 16-45mm. Let's go ahead and discuss kind of the plan for today, how we're going to make this all happen. So as far as the comparison goes, I'm going to be putting my Fuji X-T30 with its Kit lens, the 15-45, against the a7 III with the 16-35. Much cheaper camera, it's a much cheaper lens, and I'm putting it against an expensive lens with an expensive camera. And going through the footage right now and in nice daylight scenes like I had it, it was very hard to distinguish the two. Not an exact comparison, because obviously this is like a Zeiss lens. However, I didn't use my 35mm because this is a zoom and it can only go down to, I think, f3.5, just as that can only go down to f3.5. So I thought that would be a little more apples to apples compared to if I was to use my 35mm for that one. As I go through the footage, I have my Fuji on one track and I have my Sony on another track. Anytime I go through, make the Fuji track invisible, it's really hard to tell the difference if I don't have the labels on there. To set this up, I'm going to be going around town here. I'm in downtown Richmond, and I'm just going to be going to various location shots and shoot how I would normally do a cinematic of mine. I shoot a little differently than some might, and that I try to avoid using my gimbal and tripod as much as possible. In fact, I don't even have my tripod with me today, even though I brought the cart. Even though I had the space for it, I figured for this test, switching everything on and off, it'd just be a lot easier to, again, continue to shoot how I normally do, which is handheld. I try to just stay as still as possible, doing my hands as slow as possible. And I'll usually add warp stabilization in post if necessary. We're gonna try to avoid that, and like I do in my other comparison videos, I make a note of when warp stabilization is used. Basically, I'm gonna be trying to make a similar shot for shot between the two, like I did in my comparison of the Fuji when I first got it. In a future video, I'm gonna do just a night comparison between the two, because I think that's where a lot of people would see the difference between these two. Autofocus continuous. They're set to f11, ISO 160, and I've tried to match the settings as closely as possible. Both are shooting in kind of a flat-like picture profile that should be relatively close. Even doing the walking portion, as I continue to walk through, I noticed that the Fuji wasn't that much different. The Sony might help it with as far as the inbuilt stabilization when it comes to panning, up, down, left, right, but in general, it is extremely hard for me to distinguish the two. So even going through and comparing the two, disabling the tracks and not having any of the labels there and just doing a blind comparison between the two, it was very hard for me to tell the difference between them. In fact, the other thing I want to point out really quickly is just because I was doing this on the fly and I was trying to get a lot of footage, and I got about maybe 2 hours worth, which I then compiled into maybe, I guess this is going to be close to like maybe a 20-minute video depending on how far down I cut it. But what's important to note is, even though, so what I did try to keep consistent was the ISO and the shutter speed. The shutter speed on both, because I was shooting in 24 frames per second, I kept both at 50, and mostly well-lit scenes with the exception of some shadowy scenes. Very, very hard, if impossible, to distinguish the two without knowing that the picture profile on the Sony was a little different. It wasn't as flat. Keeping this in the Eterna profile, not color grading either of the two of them, as you'll see here, it does an extremely good job at keeping up with the Sony. The only thing that I can really tell the difference is a bit of the contrasty colors. The Sony looks a little more rich, and that only has to do with the fact that it wasn't shot on a flat profile. Some of these shots I think I do add a bit of a color match LUT using Adobe Premiere, where it just auto matches it just a little bit for some of the scenes, but in general they're not. The other thing I wanted to note, a lot of people, and myself personally, I wanted to go for the A7III at first because I was excited about having in-body stabilization, and at times and for certain situations I think it would be perfect. But as I show in some of the scenes here, let's do a whip. That's the other thing that I think the Sony would be better at. You'd have less distortion when whipping them around like that. If you're panning carefully, you can get excellent results just by adding a little bit of warp stabilization. And in fact, a lot of these shots with the Sony, I would have had to do it anyways. I do think the A7III's body stabilization does help take out some of the minor shakes and jitters, but in general, again, if you're being careful as far as your panning, you might be able to do without it. There are times, like for example, when I am doing my run and gun shooting, I'd rather take any kind of in-body stabilization versus none. When it comes to shooting in these kind of situations, I have not found a reason to prefer the Sony. And as I go into it, I'll keep in some of my other talking points and things like that, but the Sony is just so much heavier and bulkier, and just to carry it around, where I could just easily one-hand shoot, even with a microphone and using like a monopod and things like that. That entire setup was lighter than the Sony, and that says a lot. I mean, you might think, oh, that's not such a big deal, but the kind of shooting I do, it is over time. For a couple minutes, sure, it's not. In general, you're gonna prefer and you're gonna appreciate the lighter setup of the Fuji. Another comparison I wanted to make, the Sony has a really nice grip. It's just easy to hold and just pull up and shoot. Fuji's is not. It's shallow and things like that, and that's a big complaint a lot of people have with the Fuji. However, I noticed it wasn't that bad. I was one hand shooting them both for the most part, where I would have the Sony here and I'd have the Fuji here, and I was basically like walking around like this, as I show in some of the scenes. Even though that is a pro to the Sony, it's offset by the fact that it's heavier and bulkier, and in turn it's going to make you more fatigued when using it for a prolonged period of time. As far as strengths for the Fuji go, and I think this is the big one that I've noticed, especially with these outdoor scenes here, even though I as closely match the settings, high contrast scenes here, and again, I'm not sure if this comes down to the settings or not, you can take this with a grain of salt, but what I'm noticing here with these kind of shots here outdoors, Fuji being a lot better in the sky scenes, you can see a lot more contrast shapes in the clouds. You can start to see the light blue coming through. Whereas with the Sony, it's going off matching the shutter speed and the ISO. The Sony obviously is going to be a lot brighter. I thought it was a little darker on the Fuji than I would have liked it, but I was just matching them. But here, even in a scene like this, where I would say the Fuji looks a little darker than what it might ideally be. The Sony's brighter, but I still feel like there's more contrast and detail compared to Sony. If we take a look at this wall here, I think this should be a good example if we can get a shot of them both in focus there. If we go to 200% zoom, comparing the two wall scenes, it feels like the Sony isn't as sharp, doesn't have as much detail. Taking to 300%. The Sony looks significantly softer. Now, one thing you could argue is, well, you're doing a pan on them. The Sony has a couple things going for it. It's got the stabilization, so it should be smoother. I'm shooting both at the same time, just as still and just as steady, so at any point I would expect when I'm panning the Sony to be sharper than the Fuji. Slowly panning scene here, and just in general, I feel like I'm seeing more details in the brick, more texture, except for maybe that has to do with the contrast, but right there, I think that's a good comparison between the two. In this scene where I'm panning up on the sign, I think the Sony's sharper in the text. The text doesn't look as fuzzy at 400% compared to the Fuji. The Fuji is now getting more issues with that panning and out of focus compared to the Sony there. At the very end of this scene here where it pans across the grass, the trees from the buildings, to very last shot here. It's a good example for two reasons. First is you'll notice that, again, as it'll continue to show, the Sony in general is going to be significantly brighter. Not as dark for this scene on the Sony, and in general I'll prefer that Sony scene. The only thing is, however, I still have significantly more detail in the skies and the highlights there compared to the Sony. If I were to push this and color grade it correctly, I think I would be able to retain far more detail in the sky compared to the Sony, bring even more of that out. And I could brighten up the darker scenes. Again, this isn't an example of me trying to color grade as best as I can. This is me taking the raw from both of them to keep them as fair as possible. Color grading perhaps would be a future video if you guys show interest in it. As you can imagine, these kind of videos of me going back and forth and comparing them take a lot of time. In this scene here, if we zoom in again to our 400%, we got this Saab car and this Wrangler tire. I like this scene very much because it looks like when you match up the tire and the Saab to the Saab logo, it looks like the Sony might be slightly sharper in the text of the Wrangler, and maybe you have some more detail in the rust there. With the Fuji, I have more detail on the hood of the Saab car. It looks like more detail on the walls back there as well. Looks like anytime there's a highlight scene, the Fuji is doing a better job at doing better to retain detail compared to the Sony. Trying to get as close to scenes as possible so you can try to see what depth of field would look like on the two, / close-up focusing and transition focusing. I wanted to get good, just try out some depth of field, focusing on the wall there and seeing what the cars in the street behind it. A couple things I'm noticing. Oddly, it looks like the Fuji in this scene has more of the Sony perhaps might have a little more detail in some of those grains there. It's kind of hard to tell there. So that's going to be a good place to wrap up the outdoor daylight comparison between the two. I'll hopefully in the future be able to do more of a nighttime outdoor similar test, but again for testing the low light. Pretty impressed with just how similar it looked for the Fuji and the Sony, and at times I thought the Fuji looked a little better. The main takeaway I want you guys to get is you don't need to spend the extra $1,000 or $2,000 depending on what lens you get with it. For the A7 III, if you're going to be doing shooting like this, the reason I like these videos so much is I like when I'm able to explain my point as to why a budget alternative to a high-end piece of gear can be just as good for 90–95% of the shooting. Granted in low light, which I'll maybe hopefully get the opportunity to do in a future video, and you can kind of get the sense of it in some of the shadowy areas. The Sony is probably going to pull ahead, whereas the Fuji might lack a little bit. But what I like about the Fuji is it's punching above its weight class. It's pretty clean at higher ISOs, and it can be pushed further when editing. So if you know the limitations of your camera, you know how to edit well with it, you can get great results without needing a $2,000 camera. And again, if the opportunity was given to me and be like, hey, you can get an even trade for your Fuji gear for the Sony a7 III, then yeah, I would take that in a heartbeat, because that is so creepy. My Google Home just is weird. Anyways, to wrap this up, this should have given you a good idea as to how the two cameras compare to each other in normal outdoor lit scenes. No color grading added, no warp stabilization unless noted, and aside from that, no additional gear used for either of the two cameras. And you can get great results with both. The Fuji is a camera that is punching way above its weight class, like I keep saying, and it's comparing itself to a $2,000 camera, whereas this is a sub $1,000 camera. And it's doing extremely well. Granted, I think the Sony probably has better autofocus, it's probably better in low light, and it has the stabilization built in. But if you, again, like I've been saying, if you understand the limitations of your gear, you know alternatives to make your gear work a little better, you know how to shoot and edit with those limitations, then you can get great results that are comparable, if not better in certain situations, to the Sony.